Hello? What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and holy crap, there's a lot going on right now. We've got Mop Remix hitting today, if you're watching this on YouTube, yesterday as I'm recording this. That's going on. That's coming out. There's a lot to do in that thing. There's Cataclysm Classic is fully releasing here in just a few days. There is a ton of World of Warcraft to play right now, hence my last video. And we'll get into all of that in future videos, like especially Mop Remix. That'll probably be our subject for next week. But today, I actually want to keep digging at the War Within Alpha, and I want to try and give a little bit more cohesive of a viewpoint surrounding hero talents, especially now that I've had a bit more time to play around with them in the alpha, a little bit more time to sort of experiment with them a bit, see what changes Blizzard has been making so far and what other sort of design choices are happening in tandem with hero talents. Feels like a good time to give sort of my understanding of the system as a whole right now, look at the philosophy of how it works and how it's all fitting together, and sort of look forward to what's working, what isn't working, and where I'd like to see things ending up. This is going to be a bit less about the specific talent trees themselves, although there's a few that I'm going to use as examples to explain what I'm talking about throughout this video. This is more about the overarching design philosophy, the core of the system and how it works and whether or not it's working out well for the game. And to start this off, I want to look over some of what Blizzard has said about the system before to try and get an understanding of what their actual core philosophy is. Specifically, I want to examine the phrase that they used in one of their first blogs talking about the feature, where they said the phrase, "what you are, but more." Now, this is a great phrase. It's super catchy and it gets across a point in a hurry. But the problem with phrases like this is that they tend to kind of mean different things to everybody who interprets them. There's a high possibility that person A is going to take the concept of what you are, but more completely differently to person B, just because, like, well, what you are could kind of mean a lot of things and more could mean, well, basically anything. And believe me, I was a community manager long enough to know how much of a problem that can actually be. Like, the number of times that phrases like "bring the player, not the class" still get quoted to this day, even though it was at the time pretty clearly referencing an issue that was pretty specific to Sunwell at the time, where you needed like 5 shaman to be able to clear Muru and so on. There's definitely phrases like that that can get, if you look too much into what they're actually saying and you let the idea of that spread too much without really trying to define what it means, it's very easy for that to get way off the rails and then gets quoted back to you years and years and years and years and years later on. So phrases like "what you are, but more," like, it's super catchy. It's just not very descriptive. And ultimately, it's like it's trying to describe something that's a feeling. It's very subjective. It's something that everyone is going to naturally interpret differently. So to start off this discussion, I thought I would take some time and talk about how I'm interpreting that and how I am looking at what I expect to be Blizzard's design philosophies around the hero talent system, based off of phrases like "what you are, but more," but also, you know, things that they've done elsewhere, things that they've talked about elsewhere, and generally just holistically how they've been talking about the system so far. The big thing that this phrase means to me is that they want your class and spec to still feel like the bigger choices. They want you, as you choose and you sit down, you're playing, you decide to play a Holy Paladin. They want Holy and Paladin to be bigger choices than whether or not you're going Lightsmith or the other one, the Sun one that I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now. What the heck even is Herald of the Sun? There we go. So I'm inferring here that the "what you are," basically they're referring to your class and spec. They're saying we want you to have your class and spec, and we still want that to feel like you. We still want the class and spec that you've chosen to feel like the core of your character. And then the hero talents are just a little bit on top of that. Using an analogy, if your class is a bowl of ice cream and your spec is vanilla, you've chosen vanilla flavor for your bowl of ice cream, then your hero talents would be the choice between, do you want chocolate sprinkles on top or rainbow sprinkles on top? But here's the kicker. Even though it is a relatively minor addition in that analogy, it still needs to be something that's meaningful enough that A, you can tell it's there in the first place. If you put sprinkles on your ice cream and it tastes like ice cream without sprinkles, those are some bad sprinkles. And B, it still needs to, you need to be able to tell the difference between the two. Your chocolate sprinkles should taste different and have a different effect on your bowl of vanilla ice cream than the rainbow sprinkles do. So the challenge here, aside from the fact that now I desperately want ice cream and I don't actually have any in the house right now, the real challenge here for Blizzard is that you want something like Templar, for example, to feel like an addition to your Retribution or Protection Paladin, but you don't want it to get to the point where someone starts calling themselves a Templar Paladin, right? Like you don't want to get to the point where someone says, I'd like a bowl of sprinkles and I'll take vanilla ice cream with it. I want a bowl of vanilla ice cream and the sprinkles on top, and I'll take the chocolate ones, please. And assuming that my sort of estimations here are correct and that I'm getting at least somewhat close to what Blizzard's intended design philosophy for the hero talent system is, I think that design is sound, right? The idea of we're going to take our existing classes and specs that already exist, we're going to make those still be the cool thing. We're just going to add a little extra layer of something fun on top of that. I think that's a really cool and solid concept. Like we don't need 3 more specs per class. There's already, there's probably some classes that I think would be cool to add a spec to at a different point in time. That's a topic for an entirely different video. But we don't need to add 3 more specs per class to every single class in the game. Like that would be crazy. But having some sort of like mini specs or sub specs inside of those specializations, that's kind of cool. I like that. Plus the way that they're setting this up, it actually has the strong potential to be something that can be added onto in the future. Like this doesn't need to be a borrowed power sort of system where they add hero talents and then in the next expansion, they're like, and now hero talents are disabled and gone forever. They could actually pretty easily add more hero talent specs going on. Like I actually think it would be almost an obvious choice for them to add a hero talent spec to each specialization in like the further chapters of the War Within saga during Midnight and the Last Titan. I think it'd be cool if they added extra specs throughout the duration of this World Soul saga. That's hard to say for some reason. It's almost a perfect solve in my mind for the borrowed power problem, where it's no longer borrowed. It's just you get a different option later on. So there's something new and you can check out the new thing if you want. But if you really just want to stick to Diabolist for the rest of all time, it's still there. You can still do that and it's still useful. I like that. But finding the balance here is actually going to be very tricky for them as designers. Like the task for a designer working on a hero talent tree is basically come up with something that's cool and interesting, but not too cool and interesting to the point that it's more cool and interesting than your existing class and spec. In the phrase, what you are, but more, the but more is the easy part. Like you can add more all day, every day. It's keeping that what you are that's going to be very tricky. And that's been my biggest concern with the current implementation of some of these hero talent trees. They end up being a little bit too much, a little bit over the top. They end up taking center stage instead of just adding to the ensemble and building out a little bit more of what already exists. The biggest offenders of this in the current design are the specs that add or modify an ability and then make that your most important thing. So abilities like Wither for Hellcaller as a Destruction Warlock. It takes the Chaos Bolt spec, the spec that is built around what I do is I cast fire and then I do a big old Chaos Bolt and do a ton of damage. And it basically turns them into a multi-daughter with Wither. Like when I've been playing this spec in the alpha, I keep finding myself focusing almost entirely on keeping Wither up and then trying to micromanage the acute mechanic. And sometimes I even forget that I even have Chaos Bolt. So to me, Hellcaller currently in the War Within alpha is an example of a spec where I no longer feel like it's what you are. I feel like it's become something different as a result of choosing this hero talent spec. And it's worth noting that Destruction actually has this really bad in the War Within alpha right now. It's probably the worst example of this, of all of the different specs, because as a Destruction Warlock, you have 2 choices. One of them is basically now you're also Demonology. The other is basically now you're also Affliction. Neither of them really feel like Destruction, which leads me to my second largest concern, which is the way that the shared tree thing is kind of working out is showing some cracks in the design. So backing off for a second, I think it's very important that this system, you have a choice between multiple sets of hero talents. You need to be able to choose between 2 different things. Otherwise, it just kind of feels like more talents. Like if Marksmanship, for example, was like, hooray, you've unlocked hero talents, you can choose Dark Ranger. That would just end up making Marksmanship feel like it becomes Dark Ranger. That's just the evolution of that spec, and it now is just called Dark Ranger. And that's not really the feel that I think they're going for with this. So having that choice and being able to choose between Dark Ranger or Sentinel for a Marksmanship Hunter, I think is important. They need to have that choice between those 2 options. The problem is there are now 39 specs in World of Warcraft. And if they were going to make 2 unique hero talent specs for each individual specialization, that would be 78 hero talent sets they need to come up with. And given that the challenge here is make it cool, but not too cool, that's that's a lot to ask for at least like the initial release of an expansion. I think that like we could totally get to a point where there are multiple different choices. Like hell, I'd like to see 4 or 5 different hero talent options available for each spec at some point down the line over the coming years. I think that'd be pretty cool. But to try and come out with all of that for the release of the War Within, that's prohibitively high amount of work. And I know someone's going to say, oh, but Blizzard used to release things when it's done. And yes, that's true. And yes, that's definitely something that has fallen by the wayside in recent times. Not as badly as people make it out to be, but it's definitely something that they are more strict on their timetables for release than they used to be. But it's also important to note that part of releasing something when it's done is making sure that you're not giving yourself too much work to be able to finish it. And realistically, if making this system exist had meant that they needed to create 78 unique hero talent sets, I think it probably would have been a non-starter. I think they would have been like, yeah, that's not going to work. Let's come up with something else entirely and just scrap the whole hero talent system to begin with. And I do like the hero talent system. I'm glad that we're getting the hero talent system. So to that end, I'm glad that they decided to go with, okay, let's make shared specs for everything. Even if it was done primarily as a time-saving maneuver, I'm still glad that they did that instead of shelving the entire idea. Now, there is, of course, still the question to ask of, is making 39 shared specs actually less work than making 78 unique specs? Because, like, obviously a lot of these specs that they're making, they're kind of 2 different trees layered on top of each other. But the reality of the answer to that question is that it's probably sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And even if it isn't always less work overall, it will be sometimes. There are some trees that they just sort of mesh together pretty well between the 2 classes, or excuse me, the 2 specializations that can choose them, to the point where making the choice to have them be shared specs definitely results in less overall work to make the system come to life. And that's important. But anyway, I've gotten sidetracked. My original point was thinking about how sometimes an idea can mesh really well for a specific spec. Sometimes when you have this shared spec situation, you can have a hero talent specialization that is perfect for one specialization and doesn't really fit anything else in that class. So someone just kind of ends up with it. And in those cases, you basically have to pick a second spec and try to figure out how to make it work. And that can be super challenging. Like, I actually overall feel like they've done really well with this. I feel like overall there's relatively few examples of a spec that just completely doesn't make sense. But then you have things like the destruction trees, or like Sand Lane for Unholy is another one that it just kind of doesn't feel like it fits to me. And it just feels like it's someone else's thing. It feels like you're being given what you are, but also what someone else is, rather than what you are, but more. Now, I want to be clear. I still strongly believe that the concept here works. I think the core of the design for the hero talent system is solid. These are just some big challenges that they're going to need to overcome during the War Within alpha process. They're going to need to figure out how to meld the implementation to where it fits the design that's been laid out before them. So here's what I would like to see. Here are the adjustments that I would like to see as they continue throughout the War Within alpha, the sort of ways that I think that they can address some of these issues without like throwing the whole idea out the window. First off, I think adding new abilities is fine, or modifying an existing ability and making it into a new ability. I think that's fine. It just needs to, as much as possible, be done in a way where it doesn't redefine the core of your gameplay. Like Wither is problematic for Hellcaller because, at least as destruction, it then becomes your most important thing to do, where previously you were like, okay, my most important thing is cast Chaos Bolt. Now my most important thing is keep Wither going and micromanage Wither and pay attention to everything that Wither is doing. And then sometimes cast Chaos Bolt, but it's almost like an afterthought in the midst of managing Wither, especially in multi-target situations. And I think a big way that they can help solve this is just start spreading some of those benefits out to other abilities. Like, the reason I keep using Hellcaller as an example is because almost every tree, or almost every node in the Hellcaller tree, does something that buffs Wither or interacts with Wither in some way. And it doesn't have to be that way. It could be like, okay, make something that procs off of Conflagrate instead, or make something that procs off of, like, it has a little bit that goes on with Havoc. Like, have some more stuff that interacts with other core destruction abilities in different ways. Another example here is the Deathbringer tree for Frost and Blood Death Knights. And I talked about this at length in a previous video. You can go back, I think it's 2 videos ago, the week 1 alpha video. I talked pretty in depth about this. The problem that that tree has is it basically gives you a button, and then every other thing in that whole tree, it gives you a brand new button, then everything else in that whole tree just adds more and more effects and piles on more and more and more effects onto that one button. Some of those effects could be on other abilities, like put some of that stuff on obliterate, put some of that stuff on I don't know, rhyme or whatever. Like they don't need to be everything proccing off of one single ability cast. On the flip side, I will note that the Conduit of the Celestials tree, for at least for Windwalker Monk, because I haven't messed around with it as Mistweaver yet, but at least as a Windwalker, I think it actually works there. It gives you a new button that has a whole bunch of stuff attached to it, but that button's on a relatively long cooldown. So it's not something you're using rotationally. It's something that you're like, cool, I've gone Conduit of the Celestials. And also there's a few other random perks that don't have anything to do with that button in the tree, by the way. But it's a very, very powerful ability that's very important, and you're going to want to use it regularly. But it's something that you're only able to use every so often. So the rest of the time that you're playing your class, you're still just playing Windwalker, and it still feels like what you are, but now you have this extra button. The other big sort of move I'd like to see them continue to make throughout the War Within Alpha is just to make sure that every class's and every spec's fantasy is represented in some way inside of both of their hero talent options. And that's really just to head off the feeling of, I have selected a spec that was made for someone else, and they just had to give it to another spec, so we ended up with it. And sometimes that's literally just the name. Like the Spellslinger for mages, by the way, which Frost and Arcane can choose, it very much sounds like an arcane tree. Mechanically, for Frost, it actually seems kind of dope. I haven't messed around with it yet, but it looks pretty cool. But the name Spellslinger makes it sound very much like this is an arcane tree that Frost just ended up with. So I don't know what to rename that to. I don't think Frostslinger works as well, or Frost Spell or something. I don't know what to call it necessarily. I don't have an idea off the top of my head, but I would like to see the geniuses at Blizzard, who are better at naming things than me, come up with a better name for Spellslinger. I already talked about the Destruction Warlock thing quite a bit, but generally just some more Chaos Bolt or just generally Chaos themed stuff in both of the Destruction trees, not just Hellcaller, but do more stuff with Chaos Bolt in the Diabolus tree as well. I think that would help a lot. Obviously, both of them are still going to end up kind of like Diabolus, especially, is pretty much always going to feel like your Destruction, but Demonology. I think Hellcaller is more salvageable in that regard. But just infuse more chaos in there. At the very least, make it feel like whatever is the extra that's happening ties back into what you do in some way or other, beyond just it procs off of the things that you cast. And I'm genuinely not sure how to make Sand Lane not feel like a blood tree that Unholy just inherited for Death Knights. It's very, very blood themed, like the whole way through. And it already has multiple different effects that happen. It already does a bunch of different things. There's a lot that, like, it's good for Unholy. It seems very useful. It's fun to play to an extent, but it very much feels like a blood focused tree. Like everything is named like vampiric or like Essence of the Blood Queen and so on. I really don't know how to disentangle, aside from like renaming the whole thing. I don't know how to disentangle that tree from feeling like a blood tree that had to go to someone else, so they gave it to Unholy. I will say that I do think it's a little bit weird that Sand Lane ended up being a Death Knight thing. And that's just because, like, historically throughout WoW, the Sand Lane have pretty much always been represented as casters, as clothies, like as priests or warlocks, especially. That's kind of been the closest analog to what Sand Lane have been in the past. So it does feel a little bit weird for me to be like, yep, plate wearers, you get the Sand Lane tree. Obviously, blood is a tree, and blood is kind of the core of what the Sand Lane do. So I see how that connection is made there. It just feels a little bit awkward to me. That said, again, this might be a case where the solution is actually worse than the problem, and maybe it's just make sure that it's fun for Unholy and just deal with it. I'll also add on one thing that I do not want Blizzard to do in this situation, and that is don't overhaul the base classes trying to make the hero talents fit. They've been making a ton of changes in the War Within Alpha right now. Like there's so many class changes going in that I'm having trouble keeping up. I can't replay every single spec of every single class week to week. So it's entirely possible that I've said something throughout this that is no longer accurate, in which case, please let me know, leave a comment. I'd love to know where I'm saying something stupid. But also, like, it's just really exciting to see them making a ton of class changes. That's great. I love that. I feel like Dragonflight needs a bunch of class changes made in order to, like, really come into the new talent system a little bit better and flesh things out a bit and cleaning it up a lot. It's great. I'm in favor of a lot of the changes that I'm seeing so far. I just don't want them, I don't want to see them take it to the point where they say, yeah, you know what? Destruction, Hellcaller. Yeah, it is kind of weird that the single target-ish, like heavily focused, like main, like just nuker class for the nuker spec for Warlock gets turned into a tab daughter. So let's just make destruction into a multi-daughter class. Like that would not be good. Don't do that. At any rate, I still remain very hopeful for the hero talent system, and I think they can accomplish some really, really cool stuff with it. And I'm hoping to see that continue to iterate throughout the War Within Alpha. We'll definitely be keeping a very, very close eye on it. But that's going to wrap us up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Apologies for the brief sabbatical that I took a week ago. I basically couldn't sleep, and so I couldn't get a video out on time. And then we just finished the streamathon, which lasted for 70 days, by the way, 70 days of the 5-day streamathon, which ended up counting in the days that I wasn't streaming because like I was working on YouTube stuff like this, for example, ended up being just over 3 months that this streamathon lasted, which is crazy. It blows my mind. So thank you everyone who came out for that. I'm going to start, I have a ton of stuff that's been recorded from the streamathon. I'm going to start trying to incorporate into like YouTube shorts and so on, like things along those lines that we can sort of keep that train moving a little bit. And I'll have some other ideas for the stream coming up in the near future. There's a lot that I learned throughout the streamathon that I would like to continue carrying forward and just generally making the stream a more fun experience for everyone. But that's a whole other topic. I need to get out of here. Thanks again, everybody. If you haven't yet, please go and check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Devilor. And thank you so much to all of my patrons who continue to support me every month. I really, really super appreciate it. Every little bit helps tremendously trying to make this whole full-time content creator thing work again. So thank you all so much for all the continued support. There are a bunch of pretty cool perks that you can get if you check out the Patreon. So head on over there and give them a look. All right, that's it from me. Thanks again so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.